Good afternoon, everybody. So I'd like to welcome you to this session as part of Homes England's Autumn Learning Programme, which offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you've told us are of interest to you. My name's Fiona Braithwaite, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's session, which is focused on town centre regeneration. This Autumn Learning Programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. This slide summarises who the Local Government Capacity Centre are. Next slide, please. The Learning Programme is just one of the tools offered by the Local Government Capacity Centre. Our offer also includes the Housing Information Hub and a capacity analysis tool which you can use to assess capacity. We look forward to hearing how we did in the poll at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So on the screen, you'll see a breakdown of today's session. We'll be hearing from Sandra, Roland and Tan from Inner Circle Consultancy, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A, and I'll draw the session to a close with some further polls to get some immediate feedback and any ideas for future learning sessions. So I'll now hand over to Sandy from Inner Circle Consulting.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this session. As Fiona said, we'll be talking about town centre regeneration. And as a little bit of context, Tan, Roland and myself work pretty much exclusively with the public sector to deliver regeneration in all its forms, and myself very much involved in town centre regeneration. We're very often sitting on the side of the local authority as clienting architects or taking projects forward. So what you'll be hearing today will be very much from that perspective. And we hope you find this really useful. Please do pop any questions that you've got in the chat, and hopefully we'll get to have a little bit of discussion at the end. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, and I will hand over to Roland. Roland?
Thanks, Sandy. Pleasure to be here. So I think we've got a little poll. We wanted to start by asking the question, what does good regeneration look like? So if you follow the instructions and click on the poll in the chat to participate, it'd be good to just get some understanding of where people are in terms of their thinking of what good looks like. Okay, so some of the things I'm seeing in the chat: vibrant, connected public realm, places to dwell, facilitating economic activity, people using public realm, long-term stewardship of place, inclusive, thriving communities, high quality environment. Okay, should we move on? Okay, so we wanted to use this as an opportunity to ask some sort of bigger questions, and then we're going to explore some of these ideas through some case studies from work that we've been undertaking at Inner Circle. So I think thinking in terms of town centres, and also thinking of town centres in symbiosis with towns and places, the sort of bigger question about the purpose of town centres obviously come to the fore since COVID, and a lot of town centres having to rethink their purpose, and the resilience being really tested. And I think where a lot of town centres have got to is refocusing on the idea of experience, and I think that's really a case of rediscovering the original purpose of town centres. I think over the 20th century, there's been a sort of increasing focus on retail as an important function. And whilst it's really encouraging to see a return to retail in town centres, which does seem to be emerging post-lockdown, the sort of understanding of town centres as places of social interaction, first and foremost, actually quite a sort of fundamental historic point. And so that leads on to a question about what resources are necessary to create that, create the right conditions for good experience as a sort of fundamental part of town centres. So thinking about that in terms of components of a place, I think there are, like in that context of the experience of lockdown, also the shift to and from retail, and this idea about resilience. The wider context is, of course, critically important, and some aspects of wider context or beyond the control of any particular place. But the way that they come together in a particular place, we really try to understand it in terms of the relationship, the interrelationship between the society, the built environment, and the economy within that place. And that has both very specific place characteristics and also can be shaped very specifically according to the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities and challenges of each place. Move us on. Thank you. So our way of thinking about that specifically is that first and foremost, all of this is about people, and that successful places are about making places that people can thrive. So just saying that the layers of a place are really about focusing on people. So then the question becomes about what are the lenses that need to be considered and what assets need to be put in place to support successful places for people. And so we like to think about that in terms of the built environment, in terms of the physical components of place, in terms of the transport and infrastructure, and in terms of the economy that relates to that. And then the power and leverage that that local authorities have in each and every place in the public sector is really through governance and policy. And by understanding how to use governance and policy to drive economy through putting in place transport and infrastructure and places for people. I'm going to hand back to Sandy now.
Yeah. So I suppose the big question that we land on is what does that mean for us as, people that work in placemaking or in place or in regeneration, for local authorities and their role and levers that they have at their disposal? Historically, there has been a sort of narrative that, it is a role of the public sector or the government to, take the lead and deliver a lot of things within town centers. But I think all of us that have worked in this area recognize that actually it takes a lot more than a local authority or government, putting things in place, putting funding in place, delivering projects. It's actually a combination of, a lot of pieces moving in the same direction that will truly deliver regeneration. And this is not just applying to town centers, but, at kind of varying scales. In this diagram, we've tried to capture a little bit what we think might be the components that we need to think about as a sort of fundamental kind of bit of elements that kind of deliver really good town center regeneration. The first one is around placemaking. And this is really about, when we really think about places that we love, what are the components of them? What is it that makes them, attractive? What is it that makes the experience of those places really good? So it's getting the basics right of the right pieces in the right place, the right spaces for social interaction, the right infrastructure to help us move around those spaces. Economics is a really key point when it comes to regeneration, because it helps us understand what is it that's working and what is not working, and where is it that we want to get to. So what are the strengths and needs of the place, and how can we use those to kind of deliver and develop a case for change for that space. Assets, and I think this is a particularly critical one for local authorities as owners of a lot of the pieces that exist within place, and how those assets can be leveraged to deliver both spaces for work, spaces for retail, for experiences, but also for social connectivity, and how perhaps as local authorities, you can have a much different lens through which to use those assets and actually kickstart some of that change. Roland touched on it in the previous slide, but governance and stewardship is a really big part of this. And primarily, this is in getting the conditions right for that long-term management of place, how you work with partners, how they're brought around the table, and how the door is opened for others to take part in the delivery of all the good things that we know need to happen in town centers. And then the final, which is delivery capacity. And this is not just about who is going to project manage or who is going to be leading these projects, but actually how could they be funded? What is the kind of resources that you need to deliver them? And it ranges all the way from money to people power. If we go to the next slide. And I think, well, it's really easy to think about, regeneration in terms of a development project, where it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The reality, if we go to the next slide, is that regeneration is a journey of long-term collaboration. These are kind of the stepping stones that we think are really critical and what we've experienced are really critical in delivering good regeneration. So do we have a strong case for change and a strong theory for change, of what needs to happen and why it needs to happen, how that shapes a really comprehensive vision and strategy for the place. So what is the story that we want to tell, for that place? What action needs to take place? So what are the interventions, and who needs to do what? And then finally, stewardship and monitoring, so that we can continuously learn and create a really positive loop of learning across the piece. We'll pick this up a little bit more in the case studies, and how these components can be developed. But the important thing, and I think the key point that we're trying to say here is that I think it's easy to get sort of focus on one of those steps in the way, so vision or the case for change. But actually, it's thinking about what comes next that keeps the momentum going, when it comes to town center region. And if we go to the next slide. So the sort of tactics that we're going to be talking about and exploring a little bit more through the case studies is, first and foremost, how is it that we can find the right thing to do in the right place at the right time? So how is it that we can build a strong theory of change to identify the right impactful actions, whether it is to address, for example, a failing retail center, as there are so many in town centers around the country, and what are the right things that should go in that place, to address meaningful transformation of the economy of the town center. How is it that we can use that as a way to test what could happen and inform kind of future activity and help others kind of take the leap with you? The second one kind of links into this, which is around the importance of building agency and stewardship. So how do you align stakeholders toward a shared vision while empowering communities and partners to lead? We know that regeneration works best when local voices are involved, not just in shaping that vision, but also delivering that vision and understanding what needs to happen. And then the final thing relates to short and long-term impact. Regeneration can take often years to fully realized. And I think the impact of that is that it can lose momentum very rapidly. So how can you show progress quickly, and demonstrate or understand what those small wins look like activating vacant spaces or bringing communities together to build trust and sustain some of that momentum, while working towards that long-term goal. Ultimately, kind of regeneration in the bigger sense of the word is about transformation, but I think we can't forget about those kind of more tangible elements that could bring people on board and help more and more of those communities buy into the journey. So I know that there's a few questions in the chat. I think we'll move on to the case studies, and then hopefully we can pick up some of those up after the case studies. Roland. No, sorry, Tan.
I think that's me, yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Tan. Thanks for having me. I'll be talking about a project we've been working on, which looks at the regeneration of Boreham Wood. To tell you a little bit about Boreham Wood, it's one of the 5 main settlements in Hertsmere. It's really strategically located. It has excellent regional connections via rail to London, but also road connections through the A1, M25 corridors. It's particularly interesting because of its rich history in film and television. It's home to the famous Elstree Studios. I don't know if everyone knows this, but Star Wars was shot there as well. So it has a lot of strengths, but it does face varying challenges. It's often perceived as just a commuter town, and there's a sense that elements of its economy and place have not been fully leveraged to benefit the whole town. So the challenge at hand was really about understanding what are Boreham Wood's unique assets, how can we build a cohesive vision for the town that really maximizes its potential. And the way we did that was by using a theory of change framework. Next slide, please. So the theory of change is really a powerful tool to understand how activities and investment that we put in place now can build towards a vision for the future. And it really brings all the stakeholders along that journey, helping them understand how their individual contributions, their interventions contribute to a larger goal. The way we work through this is by really looking at the start and the end. So what do we know about the current situation? What are the needs of the place? What are the drivers? And then look to the future. What is that sort of bold vision we're working towards? With those two, the start and the end in place, we then try to understand what do we need to do to get there? What needs to be true in terms of, do we need funding? Is it a policy approach? Is it certain types of governance? Just what are the outcomes we're looking for, and how are we going to sort of track and measure all of this? Next slide, please. So we're using the theory of change approach to bring all the stakeholders together and really build that vision for the future together, really identifying how everyone involved is going to contribute to it, and start to build a strategic outline business case that provides that sort of framework for decision making in the future. To tell you a little bit about how we unpacked this theory of change, can we go to the next slide, please? We held a number of design sprints and workshops with all the stakeholders. But before that, we started by doing a little bit of research into what the council's priorities were, looking at the data about the place, and we came away with these key lines of inquiry. And if you look at it, it really looks at all the aspects of place and really nudges all the participants to think about all these aspects, not just through one lens. And so when we moved into the workshops, we had teams from sort of the council, we had people from the local economic partnership, the town council, as well as senior leadership. And the workshops were really crucial in sort of breaking down the silos, getting people around the table and getting them to think beyond their everyday roles, to truly understand what it needs and what it means to work in a joined up way to realize this vision. Next slide, please. We use some interesting tools to simplify the complex things that we were talking about. For example, we use personas to understand who are the people who are really invested in the town and the town center. What are their daily struggles? What are their pain points? What are their aspirations? And really start to empathize about the people we're talking about when we're talking about this vision. Next slide, please. Some of the other tools that we used, there's the rose, thorn, bud exercise, which is really a great way to start to understand what's working, what is the rose, what are the strengths, what are the challenges, what's holding the place back, and what are the seeds that we can see for the future that we really want to like nurture and grow. The opportunities that we got from this exercise, we then started to lay out against those themes to see, have we missed anything out? Are there any gaps? And then to start to understand what needs to happen now. What are the activities that are key enablers in the present that can unlock activities in the future? And who needs to be involved every step of the way? And through all these exercises, what we came away with was a vision that was really grounded in all the ideas of the place, which you can see on the next slide, please. So we have a vision that looked at all the aspects, whether it was transport, economy, the community, the built environment. And alongside this, we also had a logic model and a measurement framework that sits with it that really will help the council understand and track activities, the outcomes they want, and keep coming back to it as the golden thread that holds it all together. Next slide, please. I just want to take a moment to talk about the town center and its role within the whole town. This project actually comes at a crucial time where the council is preparing its local plan. It has a number of sort of sites in the town center that it's looking at for planning applications. And so when we were thinking about the vision for the future, we really had to acknowledge this unique opportunity that we had. How can the sites in the town really unlock impact for the whole town? And how can decisions that we're making here not have negative impacts beyond this cluster of sites, and really bring the whole town along this journey? And that was quite important to think about throughout this process of theory. So just to close, a key couple of key takeaways from this project were understanding how a strategic and collaborative approach can really unlock a town's potential as a whole, how a theory of change framework can really bring stakeholders along this journey and provide quite a robust, holistic framework for decision making along the way. Thank you. I'll just hand over to Roland now.
Thanks, Tam. So I think there's a bit of a theme in our case studies about the relationship between town centres and towns, in the sense that I was sort of trying to pick this up in the first few slides, that the town centres don't exist in isolation, of course, but the interrelation between a town and its town centre is really critical. In this case study, I'm going to talk a little bit about work we're doing in Cornwall. This is Langarth, and it's a planned new settlement that has garden village status, so it is following garden city principles. It's conceived of as in the village form, but in fact it's quite large for a village settlement. It's 3,800 homes, and we'll have a population of up to 10,000 people, and so really it's more conceived of as a cluster of smaller villages. So there will be 5 village centres which will act like small town centres within a sort of wider conurbation. And the question here is really around how do you define what a community needs in a place where we don't know who that community will be. This is a new planned town. All of the housing here will be new, and so the residents will all be new residents of this place, even though some and potentially many may come from the surrounding areas. So how do we build in that community stewardship for the long term when the community are not yet in place? And so the work that we're doing with this project is to put in place the structures that enable that community stewardship, and we're doing that through we've been leading that through a business plan, a business case process that will then in turn set up a business plan that will underpin a new organisation that will hold the community stewardship in perpetuity and into the future to ensure a successful future for Langarth. Next slide, please. So putting this on the screen, there's quite a lot of detail here. I'm not going to run through the detail. It's really just to indicate the sort of the process and how the aspect of this, which I'm going to focus on, which is around the stewardship framework, relates to the other parts of the design process and the conception of this project. As Sandy was saying at the start, in that kind of cycle or loop through a process which we sort of conventionally think of as ending with stewardship, actually by thinking about stewardship at the start of the process, that's how we ensure a continuity throughout the whole process. So that's very much what we've been trying to do in Langarth. So there's a series of key stakeholders, and they're represented in a stakeholder panel. All of this is supported and driven currently by Cornwall Council, and it's taking into account garden city standards, healthy towns principles, healthy streets, Cornwall's own design guides, and building for nature. And then that has been, those generic standards or high level standards have been converted into some specific design principles that apply to Langarth. And then that finds its way both into a design framework, which then informs a master plan, outline planning application, design codes, eventually the design and building of housing, of facilities, of infrastructure, and so on. And alongside that, we're developing a stewardship framework, which is about sustaining that vision long into the future. So that includes a series of underpinning aspects, community stewardship organisation, community asset management, the income management, and considering business opportunities within that. So it's about taking hold of the community infrastructure in the place and using that for the benefit of the residents of the place. So the representation of the community in that organisation is key to it, and the sort of exam question that I set at the start was how do we achieve that when the community aren't there? Next slide, please. So really, that's been about a different, a sort of graduating involvement of different actors over time. Cornwall Council obviously holding the space to begin with, and through Treveth, which are an arm's length and becoming an independent housing association, that they're instigating the garden village and putting in place together with developers the planning, going through the planning process to take that through the design framework stage. And as that progresses over the build out period, their involvement will gradually reduce. Cornwall Council's involvement will always remain as an underpinning, effectively a kind of guarantor for the future of the place. And then the way that we've been engaging with representation from the community is through local parishes. So the local parishes are engaged in the development of that business plan. And then as residents start to occupy the garden village, they begin to have more and more involvement and a direct representation through the community stewardship organisation. Next slide, please. So that has that's been developed through sort of process of sort of going out and speaking with organisations and with people in the surrounding communities, understanding how the garden village can become knitted into its wider context over time, and that's both physically and in terms of its future stewardship by community organisation. Next, please. Okay, so just to reflect on that, it's a different kind of project from very much sort of the example of Borehamwood, which is taking a strategic development view, looking at a new settlement from the perspective of its future management, and it's starting to build those different parts of the picture that Sandy was setting out in the outset. Sandy's now going to give a very different kind of case study for the next one.
Yeah. Thank you, Roland. And just to build a little bit on Langgarth, one of the, well, it's not necessarily a sort of brand new, or rather a sort of regeneration project in the sense that it's trying to fix something, that is perhaps declining. I think one of the interesting things about the project has been the thought process that has gone into it about understanding what does the long-term future of that place look like, and what are the kind of conditions that need to be created to make sure that it is informed and its growth informed by people that will be living there as it kind of develops. It is something that will be developed and delivered over, correct me if I'm wrong, Roland, but 15, 20 years. So we're talking about sort of generational change here. And it's been a really interesting thought exercise that's actually been quite useful to inform other regeneration work within Cornwall as well. So moving on to the other end of the scale, I wanted to talk a little bit about Nourish Hub. So Nourish Hub is, it started off as a project that was about bringing vacant retail space back into use. So the council had a parade of shops within a town centre that had been vacant for, I think, about 10 years or so. Not unusual for many high streets around the country. And there was a real desire for this space to have some form of meaningful use. I don't have a map on the slide deck, but to give you a little bit of context, this is a sort of parade of shops that's at the bottom of an estate in central London. But the entire estate is surrounded by a much more kind of prosperous area. And what this was creating was a deep sense of inequality and a lack of sort of offer for people that lived in the estate. And obviously the parade empty and not creating any revenue. So a number of things needed to be addressed in this project. And there was a real sort of driver to, or big question about could we address some bigger outcomes as part of this project. The grand sort of objective to address food poverty, and how could we actually make this sustainable in the long term. I know many of you will have experienced trying to do a project that is primarily kind of socially focused, but it kind of falling once the funding kind of goes away. So there was a sort of very kind of practical, commercial case related to this project, but also a very kind of aspirational economic case linked to this project. And it began really with that kind of theory of change of were the kind of uses that needed to happen in the space, and what were the kind of knock-on impacts that it could have, as you can see in this little diagram on the right. If we can go to the next slide. One of the biggest challenges with the project was that although we understood really well what we wanted to happen, we effectively wanted it to become a sort of affordable kitchen with some space for training and for having some flexible workspace. We knew that would come with a set of constraints, and that would be quite difficult to engage with, because the scope of things that community could inform was actually quite limited. So this is where developing an operational business plan for the unit became really helpful, because this allowed us not just to engage with the operator that would be running this unit, but also with other council departments that may be able to commission services from this work, or who may benefit from the work. So this included adult social care departments within the council, highways, because there was a sort of aspiration to have some cycling interventions here, as well as some of the economic development team for the training aspect. If we go to the next slide. Once we understood those parameters, the engagement was actually quite meaningful and focused on the early activation of the site, some cheap and cheerful, painting shutters, and having little community days. We had things like recipe exchange opportunities, and the concurrent development of the business case. One of the things that was really important for this was not to sort of ask questions about, what would the color of the hub be, or what would be the sort of things that you'd like to see in it, but actually to focus on function and on the kind of, the feeling and of the space and how it would be used by others. And that helped inform what the brief and that case for change would be for the project. If we go to the next slide. We were quite fortunate with this, that we had a really brilliant team for design in RCKA and a operator in UK Harvest that was able to work well together. And a lot of the engagement around the project was focused on developing things that could be linked to social value. So what you're seeing here is a workshop that was held with kids to develop some visual identity for the hub. This informed not just the color scheme for the project, but also allowed the kids to kind of see bits of, the work that they developed into the hub itself. And if we go to the next slide. And the way that we engaged with a lot of the stakeholders, not just community stakeholders, but internal council stakeholders, was around the flexibility of the space and the functions. So we utilized a lot of tools like journey mapping, function planning, really understanding almost at a sort of human level what would be the steps and how would people move through the space and use it. I want to say there were about sort of 30 diagrams of this kind to really illustrate how the space could be maximized and revenue kind of be driven through the space, and how it could be created to inform the business plan. The other thing that this helped inform is how we could attract different sort of people to come through the space. As I said, this ended up being a kitchen where it currently has a business model that is pay as you feel. But what we've seen is that over time, there's been different customers coming through the space. So I guess the thing that we've learned from this project is that a lot of the regeneration, work is about storytelling, and we need to sort of understand what is the kind of stories that will appeal to the different potential users of the space to make it sustainable and commercially viable in the long term. And if we go to the next slide, this is just a picture of what it looks like today. And the final slide, I mentioned earlier on the importance of measuring impact as we go. And this is just a sampling of the metrics that we were using to both communicate with the council what was the kind of the good outcomes that were coming from the space. This was just within the first 6 months of the project. This has now been open for about 2.5 years, since just about the end of the COVID pandemic or COVID lockdowns. But also it helped kind of make the case for, I mentioned earlier on, there was a sort of ambition that we wanted this project to be a place that could bring other services into the space. I remember seeing a question earlier in the chat about how you can create, spaces for social interaction that still, had some sort of commercial edge to them. And I think this is a really good example of this. The hub operates, commercially as an entity. It employs people. It delivers, in effect, a sort of food service. But in demonstrating that actually with, a more focused plan on addressing food poverty, on targeting specific groups, on, their employment strategies, that collaborative work with the operator has really enabled the hub operators to have a conversation with the council about how they could support other outcomes across the piece. So one of my favorite things about this space is that it actually has helped reduce the number of visits that are required for older people in that particular estate, because they actually get to have a conversation with someone that's delivering them food. So this is really a project that's delivered a lot for that community, and I think we've shared a link on it in the kind of follow-up discussion. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so this last case study, we wanted to share it because I think it's not a UK sort of case study, but we thought it really illustrated kind of the art of the possible. If, as I've heard many communities say to me, if the council would only get out of the way, this is what we could achieve. About in 2018, so about 5 years ago, the city of Milan understood, or they did a study where they actually identified that a huge proportion of residents didn't have access to any kind of safe public open space. They wanted to identify how they could have more neighborhood streets, more places for play, more places that children could play in, and how they could do this in a way that was high impact and low cost. So if you go to the next slide, what they did is they did a call to action, where they basically opened the door and said, we would like to invite ideas. We have some bits of land and sort of flexible policy, to understand where is it that public open spaces would be most welcome, who would like to be involved in delivering them, and what is the kind of input that you could have in these spaces. So you can see here a sampling of who responded to this call to action. And if we go to the next slide. In the background, what the city of Milan was doing was a little bit of analysis on what might be some spaces that they could offer up, gathering a little bit of funding, and putting together some templates for community collaboration agreements. What followed is they began working with defined groups within different areas across Milan to both design and deliver some of these spaces. And when I say low cost, if I remember correctly, that they were able to deliver each of these spaces for under 10,000 euros. So if we go to the next slide. So here you can see an example of, kind of how these places were beginning to be defined. One particular benefit of this is that the residents themselves identified a lot of very small and slightly less used car park areas within pockets of Milan to deliver some of these places. Because a request came from them, it helped make those conversations much easier. I'm our colleague in Milan assures us that parking in Milan and in Italy is just as contentious issue as it is in the UK. So if we go to the next slide, and this is what the spaces look like today. So as a result of this project, and in about a 4-year turnaround, the city was able to deliver those 22,000 square meters of new pedestrian areas across Milan, most of it driven by residents. There were 4 piazzas created, and I believe there's a few more in the works for the next year. And the kind of really big impact number, now 50% of Milanese residents live within 15 minutes of this Piazza Aperta. So that's a sort of project that's been really successful. It really started as a way to test and pilot some ideas, but it's been a really kind of quick and useful way to demonstrate what these spaces could really bring at a neighborhood level and at a sort of high street level. And importantly, it's something that's really benefited businesses sort of around those spaces and helping sort of dwell time. If we go to the next slide. So what are our top tips? To sort of summarize where we are. So first and foremost, these are captured in our slide deck, but first and foremost is, the kind of point that a plan is important, a vision is important, but they kind of need to happen at the same time. A strategy or a vision that does not have an action plan attached to it, it's quite easy to put it back on a shelf. And I can't tell you how many times Roland and I have stepped into a project where there's about 4 different visions or strategies that came and went because they didn't understand what could be the next sort of tangible steps that needed to be taken. So if you take something away from today is making sure that whenever there is a commissioning for a strategy, that does have to include an action plan. The second one is pretty obvious, but it's about the power of collaboration, and that actually one of the things that we're observing in our work is that there's an increasing focus on, tangible collaboration, on like a lot of support and authorities being able to demonstrate that this is an idea that didn't just come from data, that it came from, that input from people. And the most kind of success that we've had with funding, for example, has been very much linked to that, that demonstration of support. The third one is linked to the example that I just showed, which is how do we kind of keep the door open for ideas and making sure that, we're creating agency within that partnership. The fourth tip is around those, what we talked about at the beginning, how you can create those tangible, like little steps to demonstrate change incrementally. And, how pilots, for that fifth point, can have a hugely impactful sort of effect on demonstrating long-term change and bringing people along the journey. So with that, I'll close. And I know we've got a lot of questions in the chat, so if we can probably jump to those. Lisa, I think, are you throwing some questions our way, or Fiona?
No, it's hi. Thank you. Thanks very much, Sandy, Roland, and Tan. So yeah, as Sandy said, we're going to move to a short Q&A, and we've selected some of the most popular questions that have been posted in this chat to ask our panel. So I shall just go to those. So I think the first question, maybe to Roland, there's a number of parts to this, so I can repeat if required. Which types of town centre businesses are doing well currently from what you're seeing? And what types of town centre businesses are struggling and failing currently? And then there's a couple of follow-ups, but I'll let you go with that one, those two to start with, if that's okay, Roland.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I was going to bring in, actually, in my response, there were a couple of other questions that I thought were related around how do you ensure sort of good community facilities and services in that, and also the question of how do you deal with the meanwhile while regeneration takes a long period of time. Because I think the sort of time here is the critical thing, isn't it? I think that's a sort of that's another theme of all of our case studies and what we've been trying to kind of explore here. Is it's about the long-term thinking, and it's not I think where town centres and regeneration schemes more generally tend to fail is when there's a sort of fixed view of point in time that everybody's sort of working towards that point in time, and then it's done and we move on. Whereas I think that going back to that very original slide that Sandy was sharing about the sort of cycle, which is also a loop, and thinking about the future at the outset and starting to move things forward continuously over that period of time. So to bring that back to the questions that you phrased, I think what's been interesting is the experience post-COVID, and the data currently is actually showing, I think this is more focused on the major town centres and city centres, but it's showing the revival of retail, and it is pretty much at back to the level that it was pre-COVID. And what strangely, in some ways, what's driving that has been partly to do with logistics costs, that actually the cost of online delivery is forcing retailers to re-look at physical shops and trying to encourage people back to physical shops. But of course, that's happened over a period of 5 years since, pretty much 5 years since lockdown. So what we've seen is that towns that have town centres that have survived well or done better during that process, the ones that have proved more resilient have been those that have not had a narrow whole focus only on retail. And that kind of breadth of purpose and function built around community need, built around specificity of place and what people actually want, has made them more resilient and more able to change. But it also means that when retail comes back, there's an opportunity for a much broader offer that is really around, I mentioned the ideas of sort of experience, but it's really built around place and the experience of place that people want, which includes retail and of which is an important economic function, but the over-reliance on it as the functioning of town centres is a problem in itself. I think there's a phrasing in financial markets that when the tide goes out is you see when people have been swimming naked, and it's the COVID in a way has been a little bit like that with some town centres. Those that have rather narrowed and become sort of monoculture, they've struggled more to prove resilience. So I think this idea about the breadth, but it being really built around community need, and so that also links in, of course, to communities and facilities and services, and some of the ideas around community service hubs and how they can maybe have quite small physical footprints, but can be a really important anchor in town centres that are rediscovering their retail and sort of more commercial functions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roland. That's great. The next question is around intensifying residential in town centres, and can that generate funds to pay for other less commercial improvements? And I think in terms of Homes England's approach here, we are working more in the regeneration space as part of place-based approach in our priority places. And as part of this learning programme, there are 3 sessions about place in terms of North, South and Midlands for how Homes England work. And they'll be available soon on YouTube, so they might be worth kind of picking up if you didn't attend those when they were on. Got a couple of questions here, which I think Tan will hopefully be able to answer in respect of Boreham Wood. One was around how has this approach actually unlocked regeneration and what was the end result? And then there was a follow-up one, which was about whether Boreham Hertsmere had a united corporate approach and a vision for the regeneration project. Thanks, Tan.
Thanks. I think there was a third question that went along with that. I'll try to answer them together. It was around how are you sort of getting investment into the town center using this approach as well. So I'll start with, did the council sort of have a corporate approach to it? I think the key thing I wanted to show through those workshops is that everyone coming to the table had a theory of change in their mind. And what those workshops did is really build a cohesive vision that builds on everyone's strengths and ideas and what we know about the place. So that brings together sort of economic expertise or what we know about housing or what we know about the existing assets. So what we're left with is something that's sort of greater than its parts. In terms of sort of where we're hoping to go with this and how it will attract investment, I'll take the idea or the example I gave of the film industry, which is quite a big asset for the town. Using our approach, we had to think about how we could leverage that asset in many ways. So economically, it was about thinking about, okay, who works in this industry and how can we sort of support them better? Do they come and do they leave? How do we make them stay? Who in the town sort of doesn't benefit from this industry yet? So is it about thinking about skills or education programs and bringing them in more? A couple of these studios actually sit within the town center, face the high street, but not necessarily interact with it. So can they play a bigger role in the tourism in the town and really sort of put it on the map and play a bigger role in its identity? And how do all of these come together and have a ripple effect that places Borehamwood not only sort of maximizing its own potential, but playing a bigger role regionally. So that's how we wanted to go about thinking about it, taking it from the vision and really breaking down those activities to see how it plays a bigger role in the place. I hope that answered the question.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tan. I think, Sandy, hopefully you'll be able to pick this one up. The question was around, do you look at human behaviour before approaching regeneration projects like lifestyle, leisure, spending patterns when it comes to town centre regeneration? Because we regenerate for people, but do we know who these people are and what make them come to the town centres, spend time, spend their money there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in that same question, I think there was a sort of discussion that people are and should be at the center of regeneration. This came up a lot in leveling up fund work, for example, where there was, a need to bring more people into high streets and a need to understand what was a customer base, what were their preferences, what might they like to do. There's a couple of really useful data sets. They're not perfect, but I think they can start to give an idea in the absence of doing huge surveys about what might people want to do and see in town centers, how they spend their money. Some of those are, I think, what used to be sort of mosaic profiles. I can't remember the Experian data. And there's also another set of data that is quite useful to look at, which is related to cultural profiles. The cultural profiles are quite interesting because they start to tell us about the kinds of experiences that people want to see or what they're attracted to in town centers. And I think they can form a really useful baseline to kind of begin to shape who we need to speak to, where the gaps are, and what, how we might sort of approach them. Where one kind of really clear example where we're using that is we've just started doing some work, or we've been working a little bit in the regeneration of Norwich city centre. And there's a big focus on the sort of city hall building and how that might be used by the council to deliver a lot more uses within the town centre and drive people into the centre. And this is where this data has become a useful way to kind of open up conversations and understand what those user groups might be. But I think we need to sort of recognize that with town centers, there will be a sort of wide range of people that come to them. And I think picking up on Roland's point, it means that the response and the sort of offer that exists within town centers needs to be shaped accordingly. I think the more that councils can share that data with businesses, it can help inform their business plans as well, and help them be much more resilient and nimble in how they adapt their offer.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sandy. And Sandy, there's just another question here. Are there any case studies in a town where there's a huge conservation area and many listed buildings? Is there anything you can share or draw on that?
Yeah, watch the space. I'm fairly sure we can share Norwich because that's one that is very much a sort of big conservation area across the whole city centre. And Roland, I'm sure there's others that.
Sorry, just a meeting. Yes, I'm sure there are. I mean, I've worked in heritage, very heavily heritage context in town centres in the past, and I think obviously the responses become much more about the physical detail. It becomes, really. I think the key is to understand heritage as an asset rather than as a constraint. It's very often seen as just being a set of constraints that you have to sort of tiptoe around, when actually the most successful historic places that we know really make the most of their assets. And I think that's the sort of general point we're trying to make here, isn't it? And it's very much the case in Borehamwood. In Borehamwood, it's as much about the creative cultural heritage that exists there, but it's about leveraging that to to share and celebrate what a special place it is, so that people can enjoy it more, and that all drives positive growth, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a question here, I think perhaps for you, Roland, in terms of how do you deal with town centres with a predominant use, such as cars travelling through to other areas, strong uses by particular types of users, which makes it difficult to supply space for other users, such as pedestrians? And is there a need to give consideration to wider town centre accessibility from surrounding areas? This is often a driver in terms of bringing people in.
It's a really good question, and I think it would be easy to sort of dive into the sort of the challenge of car-dominated town centres, which definitely can be a huge barrier. But I think there's a sort of broader question here, which is we were trying to make the point at the start that town centres can't really be understood in isolation from the towns in which they're in, from the places in which they're in. And that accessibility is really key. And I think it's key to inclusive growth and inclusive regeneration. I think in a way, one way, if you take the lens of saying, well, regeneration is about being, serving communities' needs and using the power of community to drive the future vision for a place, then it's really critical that it's the whole of the community and that people aren't being left behind, that sort of term community isn't just a kind of loose umbrella, but actually is understood as people's experiences and lives being really quite different, and being able to find a way of what the process that Tan was describing is really trying to find a way of bringing all of those very different perspectives together. Because I think that there was another point in the questions about housing in town centres, and I think there is a huge opportunity in rethinking the future of town centres to drive growth and to ensure vitality and viability in the town centre, is to have more housing in town centres. That's definitely a positive thing. Mixed use, definitely entirely positive. But I think what must be remembered in that is that it's not a mutually exclusive thing from increasing the accessibility of the town centre for people who already live in the town, and especially looking at little pockets of deprivation. So often in town centres, these there are very tightly defined, quite deprived pockets, and unless you're very careful and sensitive about how regeneration is delivered, there's always a danger of reinforcing that. I think initiatives like the Nourish Hub that Sandy was going through that's not only about physical accessibility, which the original question was pointing at. That's true as well, but it is also about kind of economic accessibility, and about, it's just about the idea of inclusion. And I think if we take that idea of inclusion as a sort of driving objective of regeneration, then we end up with much better, much more resilient, much healthier, much more successful places.
Brilliant, thanks, Roland. And perhaps Sandy, one for you. How is community ownership of regeneration fostered, and how is affordability within regenerating centres enabled?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things to sort of recognize about taking communities in that journey to have more ownership is sort of understanding their lens. I think the sort of exercise that Tan talked about in terms of understanding places through the lens of different personas was really useful, because I think it helped local authority officers put themselves in the shoes of how might different users experience place and what might be the things that they're worried about. When we're talking about sort of community ownership with uppercase C and uppercase O, the other thing to sort of recognize is that there may be a sort of capacity gap or a sort of knowledge gap in, you know, being able to take on assets, for example. So there's often much more worthwhile effort in building that capacity within those groups, working with them in partnership, than actually kind of plowing a lot of money into an asset that then the sort of a community sort of group or a sort of community body may not be able to sort of operate and kind of take care of longer term. So understanding that there's kind of that transition period has been really key. And that's something that we've definitely observed with the Nourish Hub, even though it was handed over to an extremely capable operation and charity. They'd never operated an asset like this. So it took a little bit of time for them to get their sort of heads around, you know, operating a building. And it's now that they've really they're flying with it, but it can take time.
Brilliant, thank you. And also just to add that this topic came up in this morning's session on community priorities for placemaking with the Northern Housing Consortium. So probably another one to kind of look back on when they're uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And I think probably the final question there, maybe the last one for Sandy, in terms of around a bit more on local people, what's the best way to engage local people to understand what they would want in their town?
I don't think there's like a singular answer, but I think what we've found best is to the very obvious, you know, go to people and offering a multitude of channels for people to engage. We've found, for example, that framing engagement around activities can be a really, really meaningful way to engage with people. So, as I said, with the recipe exchange to understand and ask questions and have conversations, that can be quite resource intensive. So a combination of more passive methods like surveys, but then more active methods like the recipe exchange would be a really good way to sort of do it. And I think also recognizing what is it that communities really have scope to change and transform. It's quite easy to ask communities sort of, what do you want? But actually, if we can ask more pointed questions like, what are the kinds of, you know, how would you use this space if it was provided, can provide a much richer picture in terms of engagement.
I think, Roland, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up because I think it relates across to one of the earlier questions as well about the sort of meanwhile. And I think like the whole, you know, the physical development takes a very long period of time. And I think, again, the sort of opportunity to use that time for meanwhile developments that can test a number of things, including be a vehicle for community engagement in trying things out and explore, like in an exploratory sense, but also at the same time then testing, you know, the commercial viability of things, so that you, exactly as Sandy is saying, you're not just asking a kind of open question, but you're saying sort of what if we tried this, how would it work? Would it work? Would it, you know, will it survive? Will it prosper, and so on? And I think, you know, what we've seen in some places that have taken quite a pioneering attitude with that is that quite often those meanwhile uses become almost permanent because they're so successful and viable and become really adopted. And they're also, because they're relatively low cost at the implementation stage, there's almost an opportunity to continuously shape them, like they can move in a direction that's more beneficial. So I think that sort of test and learn as a sort of co-design opportunity with the community is really something that shouldn't be overlooked.
Brilliant, thank you. I think just to probably wrap up, there are a couple of questions in the chat around Homes England and whether we've got some database of information in terms of who's working in town centres and partnerships. I think probably the best way to deal with that is to get in touch with us in terms of through the local government capacity centre, and they'll pass you on to the regional teams, because the regional teams will know these things, and then we can point you in the right direction of the right person, and hopefully they should be able to help. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So thanks very much for your time and all your contributions, and to Sandy, Roland and Tan, our presenters. We finished a little bit ahead of schedule, so I can give you some time back in your diaries today. And thank you very much for your engagement and input into this really interesting session this afternoon. Thanks very much. Bye.